All right, welcome to Story Studio Podcast. Today we're going to do plotting. So, through the magic
Dave is going to plot very quietly, though.
He is plotting. He's been plotting since I met him. Yeah, through the magic of the internet, we actually know that the episode that you'll listen to next with Bonnie is really good, unless Jim forgets what I said about changing the order around. So that one will be next because we've already done it.
So I really like knowing the future like that. It's really great.
I think that I've solved that. Finally, for people have been trying to figure out time travel. It's like suckers.
Just do shit ahead, right?
Just do shit ahead of time. It's real easy.
Yeah.
It's kind of like when that year 2000 bug thing came around, and I was like, I've already looked at the internet, and I know that it's later in like Japan and stuff, and things are fine. So it's
Were you worried about Y2K at all?
A little bit, just because there was so much hysteria. Not in any like logical way, but it's one of those things like everybody around you is freaking out a little bit. So I'm just
there's
curious.
A chance. How about
it's the same thing as when you go through a metal detector in the airport.
Yeah,
I know I'm not carrying drugs or a weapon, but I just am worried that somebody planted something on me.
You never know when a bomb might be put up your anus.
Right?
No, it's
accidentally.
It's true. I every time I'm kind of nervous, even though I haven't fired a gun since Camp Oaks and I think 5th grade, but I still think there's one on my purpose or there's coke in my butthole. And like I've never had coke in my butthole, but standing there in the security line, there's at least a chance that I do.
Never coke. Not even the soda.
Well, who hasn't had a bottle of coke?
I did lose a Pepsi challenge with an enema once, though.
That was the challenge.
That was the challenge.
All right, so plotting. So maybe a good place to start with plotting is plotting versus pantsing, right? Like the whole thing. I know people get kind of allergic to the idea of I don't want to plot because it feels restrictive.
I was against it for a very long time.
I am so
okay. That's interesting. Yeah, I want to hear what Sean has to say, but I want to go back to specifically what Dave just said in the way he said it. But go ahead, Sean.
Well, I used to be somewhat on the fence. I used to want to plot all the time. Pants all the time because that's how my hero did it, Stephen King, and that's who that was the fun of writing, was sitting down and figuring out a story. The first time I ever did it, it's a little bit like you're kind of crystallized, right? When you're little and I just read Salt, Sugar, Fat, which is an amazing book that I highly recommend to everyone in the world.
Also, my stripper name.
Oh, that was fantastic. Have you been waiting for me to talk about the book in public so you can say that?
No. That comes to me whenever I hear something even.
He's got a list of secret jokes, kind of like when Chandler was tracking his creations in Friends.
Wow, that's just amazing. Salt, sugar, fat. Yeah, it's really good. But it also, oh, damn it, I lost my train of thought, so I don't even know.
Plotting, you used to pants, and like your hero, and then.
Yeah, I don't remember why I was talking about that book, but anyway, the further and further I get away from that, the more like painful it actually feels, and I just don't want it anymore. It's when I'm writing, I want to write successfully, and I want to not have mistakes, and I want to not have a bunch of time lost in the edit. And the more time I spend up front, the cleaner that draft. And the more enjoyable I have writing. And I don't ever want to go back to a place where I'm pantsing it, because that's where I make mistakes. And all the things, it's taken me this long to realize, but now it's like just a bone deep certainty that it's not all the fun that I want from pantsing, I'm going to get with a solidly structured story, because you have to pants. That's what writing is. You're still making things up. I don't make up less things with a structured outline. I make up the same, if not more amount of things, but I do it without being under duress.
Okay, so Dave said specifically, I already forget the exact wording, but something like I used to never want to do that or something. So does that mean I actually don't know the state of Dave affairs, shockingly? Are you fully plotting now?
Does anybody ever know the state of Dave affairs?
No. Not unless he's having an affair.
Uh-oh. Dave, you're muted.
Yeah, I'm loving this, though. It's really great.
He can't even defend himself.
Right. I do meet a lot of sugar daddies at the strip club, so you never know.
Well, with a name like that.
Yeah, well, yeah. And the reputation that goes with it. I still mostly plotting, but I enjoy the process of discovery, and a lot of times, like I can't get that full discovery while I'm writing out a plot ahead of time, because I'm not really in the characters' heads. I'm not really in the world yet. It's not until I'm writing where that sort of magic of discovery comes. So I'd say I'm probably 70-30 right now.
But you're drifting a lot closer. Would you say you're drifting a few points per
Oh,
project?
more than I've ever been. Yeah.
Yeah.
And knowing the end game helps immensely. Like I used to never know exactly what I wanted at the end, and beginning with the end in mind does help significantly, because you can foreshadow and set things up properly rather than just discovering the end and then trying to go back and make a way to retrofit it. Like, oh wow, yeah, that's exactly what should have happened.
Which you can do, but it's harder work.
Yes.
For sure. And I mean, we talked to Bonnie in several of these episodes, and that's exactly what she's saving us from, is to go in and see, okay, so you even when we have the ending situated, she'll look at that and say, okay, this ending is good structurally. Like, I understand why you want this ending, but it has to tie into the plot in terms of what these people need to go through. And so until those two things are tied together, that's a lot harder to get. I mean, I say this from the experience of well over 100 books now and many, many different authors. And that is a repeating pattern. The themes of your story and making your character arcs and climaxes really, truly, deeply intersect in a meaningful way is so much more difficult to get if you're just writing and discovering as you go along. It happens. Of course it happens. And I think it's actually rather elegant the way it seems to always happen in Realm and Sands books. You know, Johnny will start writing, and then we'll really know what the story's about. And then that theme will be a pattern that echoes throughout the book. And then it's my job to make that surface as much as possible before it becomes a final product. But the difference between having that bubble up from the creation process as we're going through the book the first time and understanding what it's supposed to be before we even get into the kitchen is it's a different experience. And one, you know, we're growing out of the one and into the other. And I think it's rewarding for not just us creatively, but our end product.
I would think that.
Go ahead.
I would think that, you know, somebody that, I think a lot of traditional writers, you know, like Stephen King or somebody that take 6 months to a year or two on a book, however long they take. I think for somebody like that, a lot of it is like that first draft is almost like plotting.
Yeah, I agree. It's almost like the outline that we're creating now is their first draft.
Yeah, and then they fix it in the second, third, and 80th revisions, and I mean they take a lot of time on it. And I think for them, they have that luxury. They have they have somebody supporting them, like the publishing company that is giving them enough money where they don't have to put out more books per year like a lot of indie authors do. And I think that's a luxury that they have. But I think most working writers that are, putting out more books, they have to get better at plotting ahead of time.
And I think it's on a continuum too, because what Sean said about discovering like themes and stuff, that there's some of that I just it can't be done in the outline level. Like it's just, I will learn stuff regardless. But it's a little like...
But I think that's always true. I don't think you're ever going to get it all in the outline. And if you're trying to do that, that's the false quest.
Well, it gets the bulk of it, or a large part of it, so that second pass is pretty much always, not always, but I know that with a book like a thriller that we wrote recently, there was a lot of thematic stuff that I really, like, I actually wanted to take a second pass. I don't normally do that. And just to kind of nail that down, because it really evolves. But the difference is it's evolving further rather than coming up de novo, so you have to do that. I was actually going to ask Dave a question, but he left. So you go wait. Maybe I could just ask it now. What do you think? Do you think I'll get a good answer?
I do.
Yeah. All right. Well, I was going to ask, and I mean, you can let's talk about him anyway. Let's talk about Dave behind his back. So he said, I guess I didn't realize when we were talking about plotting versus pantsing, and then he started talking and I'm like, oh, it just, and I guess I kind of knew this, but he's doing his own outlining. Dave, you're doing your own outlining. That's not something like with me where somebody's giving you an outline.
Yeah, we'll have story meetings, and then I'll do the outline on my own usually. So.
Is it accurate that I feel like Collective Inkwell that Sean is like the kid who goads the other kids in the background going, yeah, do it. It feels like Dave does the outline, Dave does the draft, Dave does the revision, and Sean.
Well, I don't like an outline
architecture
to me because that robs me of the discovery, and I like that process.
No, the way it works now is we'll have an outline and I'm sorry, story meetings, and Dave will turn them into an outline. But that's hard that was a hard process for Dave to get into because it's really not natural. But the project that we just finished, we wrapped something this week that I'm really proud of. A long time coming, and Dave did just a phenomenal job on it. And I don't think he would have got that job without that outline. Like he would have, I've seen him do a similar project to this before, and he would get lost like for 6 months at least.
Oh yeah.
Literally lost, not even just in his writing.
Well, yeah, I mean,
wandering around the neighborhood, half naked, running into things.
Shitting his pants.
Yeah. Closing out a series is difficult for me because there's so much I'm afraid I'm going to forget, things I feel like you have to deliver on, and reader expectations, and I want it to be great. And with Available Darkness, I had a very difficult time, and I was also dealing with really bad depression. So I forget how long that took, almost a year. I don't even know. It was just
it was 9 months. I think.
It was incredibly long. And White Space, I think, was more daunting to me. It was something I didn't want to touch for a long time. I know a lot of people are waiting for it to come, and I'm like, no, I'm just not mentally ready yet, because I was worried I would fuck it up. And I think all the confidence I got from the stuff we worked on over the past year, and writing out the outlines for other stories, ones I'm not even involved in, I think getting that sort of mechanical structure in place helped me a lot for this. And it took 2 months and a week. So I was 1 week past deadline, which is probably the best I've ever done.
It's the best he's ever done, especially for the quality of the work. And as far as our process, I really enjoyed the process this time. And one of the differences is the quality of Dave's outline really did dictate the quality of his work. Now, it didn't follow the outline completely. There were places where it veered off, absolutely, for sure, especially when it came to the number of people who died, and I'm not even making a joke. The death count was, I think, double what we talked about. Although he reminded me that I was responsible for the most significant death, which I had forgotten about, so I take full responsibility for that. But we batted this back and forth, and it was the best outline that I had seen from Dave so far, because it was more action oriented, as far as these are the events that have to happen during the scenes, where typically, I can get a 10,000 word outline from Dave, but it's not like half as much story there as a 20,000 word outline that I would start to write from. Not even close. There'll be maybe 10% of the amount of story, but there'll be a couple of chapters that are almost fully written, like with dialogue and everything. And you could just see as Dave's writing this outline, he got really into the scene, and he was there, and he was practically writing the story. Where this outline was more like an outline to carry out a full entire 6-episode story. And it had the twists and the turns, and it had the episode changes. And what that did, it's like what we talk about when we say, before you give your work to the editor, it's best to give it the best possible shape that it can possibly be. You don't want to hand your draft to an editor if it has a bunch of typos and stupid commas and just like idiot things that she has to spend all of her time fixing. And then she's giving you a book back that's like, oh, okay, well, here, you actually could have done that yourself. Where if you get it to the best possible shape, then your editor can take the time that she has devoted to your book to really sharpen it and make it the best it can be. And so that's what I found with this draft. We had done such a good job in our story meetings, and Dave in the outline and the draft, that the time I got to spend on it is the stuff I do best. And my edit was fun and my polish was a joy. And I had extra time. There were a couple of scenes where Dave's like, hey, yeah, this is just kind of empty and I'm done. Can you pick it up? And I was like, absolutely, because I have the time to do that. I can jump in and enjoy the story. And I think top to bottom, I felt very many times I just wanted to reach out during this and tell Dave, I'm so excited about the next stories that we're going to tell together, because I feel like our process has finally evolved. And it's interesting because Dave and I started. I mean, we started this whole thing. We were writing Yesterday's Gone. We wrote Available Darkness back in 2009. I think we started Available Darkness, which is like a long time ago. But our collaboration didn't really evolve very much from what it was originally. And we tried a lot of different things in the company. Johnny and I write a very different way, and there's a lot of different ways, but it's kind of circled back to Dave and I are writing like we used to write. I think as we're about to start on some new stuff, we're writing like we used to write, with the same purity and the same kind of common connection, but we've really grown up. And I think that the way we're handling outlines and drafts and taking plot as, something to logically hash out ahead of time is a true evolution that will affect both the quality, speed, and I think enjoyment of our work.
So what do you think because if we're talking about plotting, like where's a good place to start? Because a lot of people kind of don't understand where to start with plotting. And Sean, you do way more of it than the rest of us. I mean, I have some of this that I've learned, and some of this that learned to articulate, and some of it is just kind of like inborn. But you start with like a hook, and then say, how would we get there? Just take us through the beginning part of the process, I suppose.
You mean like how do we start plotting? How do we?
Well, okay, I have a great idea about a guy who does X. Like that's my hook. That's my one. Like, oh, that'd be kind of cool. So
guy who does ecstasy.
A guy, yes, exactly. A guy
I
who
think they call it Molly these days.
Do they? Oh, you keep up with the kids. I told my kids that Dave is more on top of things than the rest of us, because he always knows what's coming and watching YouTube and stuff.
Yeah, he's very right on top of what's happening in youth culture, like middle
He's
school.
in touch with the kids. I can't believe he raised the Molly example. But no, like you have that hook, and then that needs to become a plot, right? Like at least the high points. So what's that step?
Yeah, for me, I always like to break it down. I know we've talked about 3 acts versus 4 acts, and 4 acts isn't really acts so much as blocks, but 4 blocks. So the very first thing I want to know, okay, now I have this basic hook. And so now that I have that idea, I kind of know how to maybe distill that into a sexy 1-sentence thing that could fit on a cover, but that's not a story. It's just an idea. So to turn it into a story, I need 2 things. I need to know what's going to happen to each of the principal characters, the main people in the story. What is their beginning, their middle, their end? What is the thing that they want most? What is the thing that's going to impede them? What's the thing that makes people like them and makes people hate them? Just kind of their general characterness. I want to know who we're working with. And then once I know who we're working with, then within those 4 blocks, I just need to know what's going to happen at the end of each block. And that will kind of help me get to the end. Like, okay, what's the biggest thing that happens, right here at the 25% mark? What's the biggest thing at the midpoint? How do we solve that or get to the big climax at the end of the 3rd, and then resolution all the way through the 4th? And one thing that I've seen a lot of us seem to have trouble with is there's not enough action at the end. It's like they're trying to draw out the story, and well, that should happen later. That should happen later. That should happen later. Almost always just move it up. Things can happen earlier in the story. There's one story right now that we're developing, and I sent it back to the outliner several times with the same message. Just move that up to the end of Act 1. Move that up to the end of Act 1. Move it up to the end of Act 1, because it kept happening at the end of the story. And I said, if this happens at the very beginning of the story, then we're telling a different story. Now everything else could be a consequence of this thing. There's no reason to wait for it. You know, if you're doing television and you're mapping out episodes of TV and you've got like big season arcs to worry about, then maybe you need to hold some stuff close. But if you're telling a novel, if you're writing a novel and there's one story and it's 80 to 100,000 words or whatever, then you don't have to worry about keeping all that stuff towards the end. Push it up, get your story moving, and see what happens. I think that's one of the things that in mapping out these 4-act structure stories that we're really getting urgency and getting to the better story faster is it's never the first story that you think. You're going to come up with an idea and the hook's going to sound good and you're going to start talking about it and digging into it. And the more time that you give that idea, the deeper you're willing to dig, the better it's going to be. You can't expect it to happen immediately. So even when coming up with the 4 events that have to happen, that's never it. Ever, ever, ever. Never one time, not one outline, not one single draft has come from a story meeting where we got the 4 events in place and then that becomes the book. That's not reasonable. And I think that is what some authors are looking for, is for something, oh, I got it. It's really worth taking the time to discover.
Yeah, I have 3 thoughts. So let me see if I can remember all of them. I'll try to go in reverse order. I'm already kind of forgetting what they are. One is I got it after, 3 or 4 things, depending on whether you're using a 3-act or 4-act structure. And I think that having done, a handful of these, you have to understand that throwing crap away is part of the process. Like, it's almost like you've got a quota. It's almost like you're a cop watching speeders with a ticket book. Okay, I need to throw away 5 things before I get to a good one. Don't consider it something that, I might need to discard that idea or that's not as good. It's almost required. So that's part of it. Like, that's normal. The other 2 things.
Yeah, don't be precious ever, 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 because the good ideas, I mean, Dave's actually great about this. He'll be like, swat it away, swat it away, swat it away. Oh, and then he gets that giddy little giggle.
Like a ninja.
Yeah.
Imagine him like in the Matrix. Yeah, the other 2 things I was going to mention that dibs are that writers.
Chris Farley already did a movie like that. Maybe.
Writers are artists, and we then want, like, a lot of times want to do that kind of slow boil, like what Sean was saying about, not wanting to move the action up. Well, it'll build to a great climax. And you're imagining this long, quiet thing where a bunch of shit happens at the end. And the problem is that people don't really kind of read that way.
Readers, they don't want that. They're not asking for that. They're asking to be totally entertained. If you look at Dave, what does Dave say why does he not get past wedding scenes very often? It's because there's not enough mystery there. There's not enough things happening. It's like, okay, I could tell that you're maybe teasing something, but if you're going to take a full 100 pages to get to the first thing, I'm not interested.
Well, you don't know if it's any good. That's the thing. Like, okay, so show me what you got, and then, okay, I'm engaged and I'm going to keep reading. If you're waiting and waiting and waiting, you have to read 3/4 of the book before you get to see what they've got up their sleeve, and then you're like, oh, well, shit, I shouldn't have read it. The other thing that I was going to mention is that not wanting to have an event early, like a big one, comes from a scarcity mindset of like, well, if I blow this, then I'm not going to have twists and turns later. And that pretty much never is the case, because it's a butterfly effect thing. Like, once you have something, then there are going to be consequences, which are going to create new problems and new character gaps. So don't think that way.
Going back to the mystery thing, I think, the scarcity mindset is a problem because they got one mystery, or they thought of maybe 2 mysteries for the entire book, or 2 big things that change everything. And that, to me, is a boring book. I want things to constantly be evolving and changing. I think a great example of this is, if you're going to look at television, 24 or Homeland. When those seasons start, each new season, you think one thing is going on, but no, it's another thing, and then it's another thing, and then
it's almost like 2 seasons of TV in one season. So Homeland's midpoint. This has been true like the last 3, if not 4 seasons. Homeland gets to the midpoint, and then it becomes a totally different show they're usually 12 episodes. So 6 episodes in, it's one show, and then they resolve everything, and then half of those characters disappear and those storylines, and it shifts, and it still matters. The 6 episodes that you've watched up until that point heavily impact the next 6 episodes, but their own arcs, their own stories, their own loop.
And they are related. It's not like
they're very related.
Yeah. So it's not cheating at all. It's not like those old cliffhanger sort of things where, well, none of that really mattered except the last few episodes. So
no, but it's everything matters. And then you feel clearly these writers aren't worried that they, got out of ideas. And it's the opposite of network television, which because of its nature is 22 or 24 episodes, and they're all an hour long. And there's filler. There's just always filler in a network show. This is the opposite of that. Not only is there no filler, it's lean. They're like, okay, we're done with those. Let's go to another thing and tie it all together. And if there's one big takeaway from this episode, if you're one of those people who just wants your plotting to be better, I would focus on that as the takeaway. Make things happen faster. Things that you have later in the book, put them in. Like, ask yourself, what would happen if I made this an act 1 turn instead of a midpoint turn? What would happen if this was midpoint instead of the climax? What would happen if what I'm thinking of the climax is actually the end of my first act? How does that change everything? A book I just finished about, let's say 3 weeks ago. It's a psychological thriller, and it took place, like the basic construct was that there was this, there was an event that had happened in this house 15 years before. And so in talking about it and trying to figure out how to piece this all together,
I was a dead baby on Christmas.
It was not a dead baby on Christmas, you monster. No, I was mapping this out with Jen, and I think it was her suggestion. She said, maybe we're telling the wrong story. Maybe the story that's the flashback is actually the more interesting story, and we just go tell that story. And it changed the entire structure, and we had to start over. We lost thousands and thousands of storytelling words in the outline stage, but it was absolutely worth it because we found the right story. And your time and place in your plotting is highly influential to the overall experience that you're going to give to your reader, and how you understand that story. And your first idea of this has to happen and this has to happen and then this has to happen is probably not your best idea.
I felt like that about the package that you gave me 2 years ago, I think. And eventually you were talking about doing it with Johnny. I don't know where it is right now. Yeah, but you had this very intricate background for this.
I know what you mean.
Yeah, and I was like, I really like that more than the story you want to do. Like that's pretty fucking awesome how all this stuff started. And yeah, so I don't know where you are right now, but maybe reconsider that.
Right. Well, remember too that, and this is maybe worthwhile mentioning in the plotting episode, because as stupid as this is going to sound, it was something that actually was an epiphany for me at one point. When I actually moved from starting a lot of manuscripts to actually being able to start and finish them, is that a premise is not a plot. And I think that sometimes people the cool world is like, well, so what if I talk about stuff in this cool world? Well, that's not a plot. I've told the story before of when I brought the hook for Dead City to Sean. And, it's a world where the zombie plague was frozen and all this stuff. And that seemed kind of cool. And he goes, oh, that's really cool. I'm on board. What's the plot? And I kind of froze, and I was like, well, I don't know. There's these cool cops that chase down the zombies, and there's this plague, but what's the plot? There needs to be a plot. There needs to be a bunch of stuff that happens in an arc.
But Johnny had a bunch of elements that, really make Dead City awesome. I think one for sure that was his and not mine at all was the word clarifier. Is that right?
Yes.
Yeah. So clarifiers in Dead City are kind of decide whether somebody is a zombie or not, whether
too far gone or because it's a continuum.
Yeah. So they need to be shipped off to the grazing grounds in Yosemite, yay or nay. Well, I don't know. The clarifier needs to decide. And there were a lot of elements that I really loved that Johnny basically gift wrapped and said, hey, here's all this awesome stuff, but we need a plot. We need a story.
And to be clear, I had none. I mean, in a flailing version that I did on my own after Fat Vampire, they cobbled together a plot because a chapter has to be about somebody and something, but they didn't do anything. I mean, I used to feel like, okay, the characters get into a room and look at each other. I could create great scenes, at least, well, good scenes, but then they weren't coherent. I mean, I would urge anybody listening to this to go back and remember that this is an arc, like this podcast series. And so we talked about character with Bonnie. We talked about character arc. And so whatever story you're telling, make sure that it isn't told in a vacuum. It is happening to somebody, and that somebody needs to undergo a transformation. It's usually a polarity switch from cowardly to brave, or a paranoid to trusting, or something like that. And that should be something that can be revealed by the catalyst of your environment. So the story is their story, but it's happening because all this stuff is bubbling around them and forcing them to change.
Right. And a lot of people think of plot as the things that happen in your story, but that's not it at all, because your original version of the zombie story, which I think was called Untitled Zombie Story for like a year, like the original version of that, it had things that happen. So plot is not things that happen. Plot are the things that happen that tie into your emotional character arcs and your climax. And otherwise, you're wasting the reader's time. So it's not enough that each chapter kind of has a beginning, a middle, and an end, and a little story, in and of itself. It has to feed into what's coming next and from what came before it to tell a whole story. And so plot are those blocks, and you have to think of them in terms of big things that have to happen, and then distill it into little things that make the big things matter.
Yeah, I can actually add a clarifying point to this, because I did struggle a lot before I reached the epiphany of, there needs to be a plot. I think that a lot of readers who struggle, they think too big. They're like, I'm going to tell the story of the Great World War. And so you're trying to tell the story of the whole world war. And I think that happens because you have a situation or an environment or something like that, and then things do have to happen. So in my example of this like zombie world, if I don't have a plot, if I don't have some people who are going to change and evolve and discover something in this little corner of the world, then the only thing that I can do is to tell the story of the whole world. And so as I'm writing, what's going to subconsciously happen is because I'm a person who's watched movies and read books, I'm going to understand that there needs to be a big climax. But I'm not going to be going toward these people having something in this little thing and this little corner of the world and overthrowing a company or reaching an epiphany, which would make sense. Instead, what I'm going to do is, okay, so I got a world with zombies and people. Okay, the whole world needs to get into like tumult somehow. And that's hard. Like it doesn't make any sense. So I think that's why that happens, is because you haven't narrowed it down small enough.
But I think that for me, that's what makes the story interesting anyway. That's what makes the plot easier. Dave actually wanted to write zombies for a while, and I wasn't that interested in it. We had done the Z series, and he had suggested like returning to the zombie well a couple of times, but zombies didn't really interest me very much as monsters. What interested me was the small story that Dead City actually was, about that company and about what society was like in the aftermath of this thing. The zombies were just a mechanism to tell a different story.
Like The Walking Dead.
Right. Really. And even The Walking Dead is more about the zombies because they're more of a threat. The zombies in Dead City become a threat, but they're not really the threat. When you start the book, that's not really the threat that everybody's worried about. It's kind of it's a threat the same way like AIDS was a threat in the 80s, in this country. It's like it was something that we were all very like aware of and concerned about. So I don't know. It's a different kind of story, but I think small can be very powerful.
Well, as an example,
afraid of telling a small story.
Sorry, you glitched out and I thought you would stop, but it is an example. So Titanic. So Titanic is like, oh, well, what if I told a story about the Titanic sinking? I can see a lot of writers doing something like that. Like, a ship slowly goes down. Okay,
but it would focus on the captain probably in a traditional telling.
Or nothing. Or it would be like, the water, they hit the iceberg. Like it would be hard. I can understand why people would have a hard time telling that story. So what did the crew behind Titanic do? or the scriptwriters, is they invented a story. So, Jack and Rose and, these weren't real people. They were just like avatars for the.
Wait, what?
So, it's not really a story about a boat sinking. It's about class struggle and love and that sort of thing, a great sacrifice. So those are the themes of Titanic, but they came from this totally invented story that was stuck into a larger backdrop. And I think a lot of people don't sufficiently differentiate the backdrop and the situation and what's going on that's causing people to change from the plot, which is those people actually changing through their own actions.
Right. I absolutely agree. So right now we have The Inevitable, which is a really big world, and it's getting plotted out in some very interesting ways because we have all these different series that are getting plotted out, and they're I don't even know how to explain this really. The climaxes of each of these individual series kind of feed in to the overall world. So they're not necessary to understand everything. If you're just reading this one series, it doesn't matter what's going on over in this other stuff, but that other stuff does inform it. And so what that means in a plot level is that it's all too big to think about. So even in our core series, which is the one that Johnny and I are writing, it's going to rely on all this other plot stuff that's happening in all these other books, and we're going to just kind of mention this thing here and mention that thing there. But if we were really getting in the weeds as to how all of this stuff worked and how all of it mattered, it wouldn't be fun to write, nor would it be fun to read. Johnny would be miserable trying to make that all make sense, and the reader would try to like, what? Oh, I don't even understand what is in this person's head, because there's so much to sort through. But having all these big building blocks, you can actually produce a pretty simple, straightforward story that hints at this much larger world, like that hints at all this stuff that's going on outside of these pages. And that to a reader is exactly, I think it's what Dave's always referring to when he's saying, I want the mystery. I want to know that there's more out there to the world than what I'm seeing on the page. And that constant hint, that constant tease, I think really engages the readers in a way that over-explaining it to them never, ever, ever will.
Well, it's what I learned while I was working at the strip club. Teasing rather than just putting it all out there right away. You're not going to get your money.
Easy there, salt, sugar, fat.
Yeah. What do you wear as salt, sugar, fat? Do you have pasties, yes or no?
I wear these little ice cream cones over my head.
Maybe this
That's
is
perfect.
Maybe this is a good note to close this plotting episode on. Is if Sean said he has one piece of advice, which was to move action forward. I would say mine is to think smaller, because I think that people always want to think big and they don't even do it intentionally, and then they end up with too much story to tell. And it's not even that it's too much story to tell; it's that it confuses the reader as well as you, even if you tell it well. So,
well, you have to be an exceptional writer to tell a really big story also, because scope is hard. You know, Tolkien has scope. Martin has scope. Like those are authors, but that kind of scope takes a lot of time also.
Well, and you're spreading it out. You don't have, it's like trying to be everything to everyone. When you're telling a book with that much scope, first of all, it needs to be really long or a long series to be able to tell it sufficiently. And second, you can't give attention to any individual aspect nearly as much because you're spread out. There was something I was, Sean's new favorite movie, A Quiet Place. It's about an alien invasion,
yeah.
But you would never know that anything existed other than this one little farm. The entire movie has basically three main characters, right? It's John Krasinski, Emily Blunt, and the girl. And the boy as well. So four main characters. And then there are other, just a few tiny little players. But and Signs is the same way. It's just this little teeny story in what could be an epic story. So anyway, so do you, I guess that's it, right? Unless you are dying to.
Well, I just have a final takeaway that if we're bringing up Signs, I would like to point out that don't ever, ever, ever do the things that he does at the ending of that movie because it's terrible.
I know what I don't know how to finish this movie. What should we do? I don't know.
Let's make this powerful alien a race who has traversed the eons and time and space to get to Earth. Let's make them allergic to water, which is mostly what's on this planet.
It's funny to think. I can imagine the aliens. Let's go there, dude. It's covered with poison. It'll be okay. Can you imagine Dave in the story meeting? It would be great.
No, like that's the thing. The things that we're talking about, signs would never have left the plotting ground. It wouldn't have withheld the scrutiny of any layer of our process. Like,
you guys want to go to the arsenic gas fire planet without suits or breathers? That sounds awesome, doesn't it?
They should
only if I could creep across it at a child's birthday party and they could catch me on film, because there's no water there.
The ending of War of the Worlds and stolen that.
All right. So thanks for watching the Story Studio podcast, for listening, whatever it is you're doing. We'll see you next time.
Adios.